Hi, my name is Cody Turner. I am a postdoctoral fellow in philosophy at the Applied Ethics Center at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. And today I'll be giving an online presentation entitled Intellectual Humility Without Open-mindedness: How to Respond to Extremist Views. This is a co-authored paper with Katie Peters and Heather Baddeley. Heather is a professor of philosophy at the University of Connecticut, where she specializes in virtue and vice epistemology. And Katie is currently a PhD student at the University of Connecticut, where she focuses on feminist philosophy and virtue epistemology. So the guiding question of this paper is, how should we respond epistemically to extremist views that we know to be false, right? Extremism and the expression of extremist views like white supremacy and election denial are on the rise in our society, particularly online. And we know that a lot of these views are false. So the question is, epistemically, from the standpoint of the philosophical study of knowledge, what is the appropriate response on an individual level to these extremist views when we confront them? And our basic answer to this question is, we think that people should be intellectually humble but not open-minded in response to extremist views. And there are two main contributions of the paper. First, we make a case for distinguishing the concept of intellectual humility from the concept of open-mindedness. We argue that these two character traits have often been conflated in the literature and that they can come apart, even though they often travel together and they're closely associated with one another. We think that intellectual humility and open-mindedness can come apart in conceptual space. In particular, we're going to argue that open-mindedness requires both a willingness to revise one's beliefs and engagement with others in a way that intellectual humility does not. So that's the first part of the paper. We argue that these two character traits can come apart. And then in the second part of the paper, we argue that they should come apart when responding to extremist views. In particular, building on virtue consequentialism, we start to make an argument that intellectually virtuous people of a particular sort, people with effects virtues, would be intellectually humble but not open-minded in response to extremist views. And I should mention that we're grateful for support from the John Templeton Foundation grant entitled Applied Research on Intellectual Humility, from which this general paper idea was born. So before getting into the main contributions and arguments of the paper that I just laid out, first it's necessary to define some terminology. So let's start with the concept of open-mindedness that we have in the paper. Basically, we understand open-mindedness as a tendency to engage seriously with relevant intellectual options and a willingness to revise one's beliefs. And our account of open-mindedness derives from conceptual work on closed-mindedness that Heather has done in previous publications. So let's break down each component of that definition that I just laid out. So first, I said open-mindedness requires serious engagement. What is serious engagement? Basically, serious engagement is when someone's making a genuine attempt to understand and grapple with the merits of an opposing view, right? They're not just dismissing it out of hand, they're hearing you out, so to speak. That's how you can broadly think of serious engagement. By intellectual options, right? I said open-mindedness, a tendency to seriously engage with relevant intellectual options. By intellectual options, we mean ideas, evidence, questions, methods, sources that one uses to inform their beliefs, right? So very kind of broad control of what intellectual options encompasses in this context. And then, as I said, there's also an encounter requirement, right? To be open-minded, someone actually has to encounter relevant competing intellectual options to whatever view that they hold. So, for example, someone who intentionally hides from competing views that they don't like, they just don't want to encounter those views, that person doesn't count as open-minded on our control. Similarly, if someone gets unwittingly trapped in an online bubble, that person also doesn't count as open-minded, right? So I'm thinking about someone who gets stuck in a personalization algorithmic feedback loop online, and now suddenly the algorithm has curated this infosphere where they only encounter views that confirm their pre-existing beliefs, right? Even if they are not intentionally trying to hide from competing views, they still don't count as open-minded because they never encounter those competing views. And similarly, these competing views that the open-minded person encounters, they have to be generated by other people, right? It's not like you can just generate these competing views to whatever your belief is just within the domains of your own head. No, you actually have to encounter other people in the world who have different opinions from you to be open-minded. And then another essential component of open-mindedness is the willingness to revise belief component, right? So to see why this component of the definition is necessary, imagine you're talking with a conspiracy theorist and they're engaging in a serious manner with you, right? They're not just dismissing your points, they're accurately representing your view, they're listening to you, they're offering relevant counter evidence. But let's assume that this conspiracy theorist, they're not actually willing to revise their beliefs, right? They're not putting their beliefs into play in a genuine way. No, actually, what they're doing is they're trying to get you to revise your beliefs, right? They're trying to persuade your mind, but their mind is not open to be persuaded. So yeah, that conspiracy theorist, they demonstrate serious engagement, but they're not open-mindedness because they don't have a willingness to revise their beliefs. Hence the willingness to revise beliefs requirement. Two other small points here. Open-mindedness doesn't require having existing beliefs on a topic, right? You can be open-minded even if you're coming to a topic for the first time. To be open-minded in that context would just be a willingness to form beliefs on either side of the issue, one way or another, right? And then lastly, I said there's this relevancy restrictions. I said, again, open-mindedness, a tendency to engage seriously with relevant intellectual options. I just kind of want to plant a flag here and come back to this because someone might seize upon this aspect of our construal of open-mindedness as a kind of objection to our argument. So at the end of the talk, I'm going to come back to that relevancy restrictions requirement on open-mindedness and talk about it further. So now, what do we mean by intellectual humility? We are endorsing what's called the limitations owning account of intellectual humility. This derives from Heather and various co-authors, a paper that they wrote, both philosophers and psychologists, where on their account, intellectual humility is a tendency to be attentive to and to own one's intellectual limitations, right? So this means being aware of your cognitive shortcomings, such as gaps in your knowledge or cognitive mistakes. It means admitting these limitations to yourself. It means caring about and taking those limitations seriously, feeling regret and dismay about them, right? So the intellectually humble person, they're aware of their different biases and they're trying to change them, right? They're not deluded about what their intellectual limitations are. So that's the basic idea of what intellectual humility is on this limitations owning account. Now, two key differences between intellectual humility and open-mindedness. And this is important because it's these two key differences between the traits that we think primarily explains why the person with affects virtues would be intellectually humble but not open-minded in response to extremist views, right? So it's really these two differences between the traits that we're focusing on in our argument, as will become clear throughout the course of the presentation. So number one, as I talked about, open-mindedness requires engaging with others, whereas intellectual humility doesn't require engagement, right? It's an inwardly directed disposition that pertains to one's own cognitive limitations. Now, in contexts where there's already engagement, right? Say you're having a conversation with someone, the intellectually humble person in that context, intellectual humility might manifest in different interpersonal behaviors like deferring to others, right? But the point is that that engagement, those interpersonal behaviors aren't intrinsic to intellectual humility itself, because intellectual humility itself is, like I said, an inwardly directed disposition on our account. So that's one key difference. Open-mindedness entails engaging with others. It's other-oriented in a way that intellectual humility is not. And then also, as I said, open-mindedness requires a willingness to revise one's beliefs on the matter, whereas intellectual humility doesn't entail a willingness to revise one's beliefs. And as will become clear, intellectually humble people can recognize and own their intellectual limitations on some matter without being open to revising deeply held beliefs. So, again, these two key differences between the two character traits are very important for our argument. Okay, a few further words of clarification before getting into the main argument. One might ask, what do we mean by extremist views here, right? We're asking, how should one respond epistemically to extremist views? If someone's interested in this topic, I point them to a recent book by the philosopher Kasim Kassam entitled Extremism, A Philosophical Analysis. And there in that book, Kassam distinguishes between three different kinds of extremism: ideological extremism, methods extremism, and psychological extremism. Our paper is primarily focused on ideological extremism, right? Where that pertains to what one believes, right? They're kind of interconnected set of beliefs. Just briefly, methods extremism would involve extreme methods, right? Someone who, for example, uses violent methods to accomplish a particular aim, although methods can be extreme without necessarily being violent. And psychological extremism more has to do with the way in which beliefs are held, rather than the content of beliefs themselves. So, for example, Kassam talks about how the psychologically extreme mindset is characterized by different thinking styles, like conspiracy thinking or utopian thinking or apocalyptic thinking. And that this mindset is also characterized by particular preoccupations with purity, whether it be religious, ethnic, racial purity, and also persecution, right? Victimhood. And obviously, all these different kinds of extremism go together. But again, we're focusing on ideological extremism in our paper. And in particular, we're focusing on ideologically extremist views that we know to be false. It's a very important point. We don't assume that all ideologically extremist views are false or are morally repugnant. So, for example, the Garrisonian abolitionists back in the day were considered to be ideological extremists, but our argument wouldn't apply to them because we think that their cause, what they believed in, was true, right? It's also worth mentioning that our argument pertains to ideologically false extremist views um, that aren't necessarily morally repugnant, right? In our paper, we focus on the extremist views of white supremacy and election denial, but our argument would equally apply to, say, flat earthism, right? Which is also an ideologically false extremist view, but it's not as morally repugnant as something like white supremacy. So we focus on white supremacy and election denial because these views are more prevalent, they're more harmful. Three final clarifications before getting into the main argument. Number one, again, we acknowledge that intellectual humility and open-mindedness, they're interrelated, right? They often travel together. They causally influence one another, right? Someone who's intellectually humble, that might cause them to be more open-minded, or vice versa. And we even concede that in practice, it might be difficult to exercise one of these traits without simultaneously exercising the other. Our only point is that these two traits are conceptually distinct and that they can and they should come apart when responding to extremist views that we know to be false. So, again, we acknowledge that there's a positive correlation between the two traits. It's just there's not a conceptual entailment on our account. Second point of clarification, we take open-mindedness and intellectual humility to be dispositions or character traits, but not necessarily intellectual virtues. In other words, we endorse what Ian Kidd, the philosopher, calls normative contextualism, the idea that the normative status of cognitive character traits is contingent upon the context in which they're manifested, right? So basically, yeah, we assume that open-mindedness and intellectual humility, they could be virtuous in certain contexts, but they're not necessarily virtuous. They could even be vicious, intellectually vicious in particular context. And then the last point of clarification, someone kind of might object and say, like, hold on, aren't you just considering the kind of epistemology here in an intellectual vacuum to the neglect of moral or practical concerns, right? Our question, again, is how should we respond epistemically at an individual level to extremist views that we know to be false? But someone might think, well, what about how should we respond morally to these views? And our response to this is this hypothetical person, they're right, but we're just kind of focusing on the epistemological concerns for the purposes of this paper. But we certainly acknowledge that there are moral considerations that, once you bring them into the picture, add nuance or potentially complicate our argument. Now, not necessarily. Those moral considerations could actually, I think, support our argument, right? Because you could say, if you follow the logic of our argument, you should, from an epistemic standpoint, not be open-minded, to extremist views we know are false. But someone might say that morally speaking, too, there are moral reasons not to be open-minded in the presence of extremists. Now, these moral considerations could potentially cut against our argument insofar as someone comes up with a case where epistemically it seems like the right thing to do would be to be closed-minded, but morally, the intuition in that case says that you should be open-minded, right? So insofar as there are cases where the epistemic counsel for open or closed-mindedness says something different than what the moral considerations say, then yeah, those moral considerations could cut against our argument. But yeah, for the purposes of this article, we're just kind of focusing on the epistemological question, but we don't ignore or try to downplay the moral considerations here. Okay, so now getting into the first main contribution of our argument, now that I've kind of set the stage and defined all the different terminology. So again, the first contribution of our argument is to argue that it is possible, right? We're not even getting into the normative territory yet. First, we're just saying, okay, it is possible to be intellectually humble, but not open-minded in response to extremist views, right? These character traits can come apart. So two cases that we start off with to make this argument. One is we think that it's possible to own our tendency to jump to conclusions about extremists without being open-minded to their views, without being willing to revise our beliefs, right? So consider, for example, the case of Daryl Davis. Daryl Davis is a Black musician who's convinced approximately 24 Klan members to change their minds and leave the KKK. Now, Davis's case seems to be a case where he was intellectually humble, right? He had this initial tendency to kind of write off Ku Klux Klan members as moral, irredeemable monsters. But he owned that limitation. He was intellectually humble, but he was never open-minded, right? He was never actually willing to put his beliefs into play and change them. And, he never said to himself, well, maybe the Ku Klux Klan is onto something, right? So he was simultaneously exercising intellectual humility without open-mindedness. Now, there is controversy surrounding the Daryl Davis case, but not because we question whether he's intellectually humble in his response to white supremacy, but because we question whether his intellectual humility might be excessive rather than virtuous. So this is an important point, right? On the Aristotelian conception of virtue, all virtues for Aristotle lie on a mean between between a vice of deficiency and a vice of excess. So for intellectual humility, the vice of excess would be intellectual arrogance, and the vice of deficiency would be intellectual servility. So our argument throughout this entire paper pertains to the mean of intellectual humility, right? Not intellectual servility. So what would intellectual servility involve on the limitations owning account of humility? Well, it would essentially entail over-owning your limitations, if you will, right? So imagine a person who is constantly obsessed about their intellectual limitations. That's all they think about. They never give due credence to their intellectual strengths. They're deferring to others more than they should, right? Like they might actually be a knowledgeable agent on a particular topic, but because they're intellectually servile, they defer to others in a case where they shouldn't. This kind of person, they're too intellectually humble, right? They're over-owning their intellectual limitations. And depending on how you view accidental courtesy, this is the documentary of Daryl Davis that kind of charts out his journey of deconverting these KKK members. There is a controversy surrounding whether he kind of dips from intellectual humility into the intellectual servility category. So that's an important distinction, right? We don't want to be intellectually servile. We don't want to over-own our intellectual limitations or focus too much on them to the point where we now think we're less competent epistemic agents than we actually are. We want to be appropriately intellectually humble. So yeah, I think that's an important point, right? So that's one case, right? One case where you can see where intellectual humility might come apart from open-mindedness. Another case would be a case where we can own our limitations and our powers to persuade extremists without being open-minded or willing to revise our beliefs about the extremist views. So another real-life case that illustrates this, Alison Gornick. She helped convince Derek Black, who is the godson of Ku Klux Klan member spokesman David Duke to change his mind about white supremacy. So apparently, my understanding of it is Gornick and Black were, I think, freshmen in the same class at college. And when Gornick initially encountered and interacted with Black, she didn't really know how to refute all of the arguments he was making for white supremacy, right? These kind of, you know, obscure race science arguments that white supremacists will bring up. She didn't have the rhetorical tools or the knowledge to effectively refute them. And she was humble about that, right? So she owned her intellectual limitations, again, with respect to her powers to persuade Black. But she wasn't open-minded, right? She was never, when hearing the race science arguments from Black initially, she was never said to herself, oh, maybe he's right and I'm wrong, right? Instead, what she did is she was intellectually humble, not open-minded, and then she went and she did her research, and then eventually had the rhetorical skills to combat all these arguments and was able to successfully deconvert Black. So that's another case where we think, yeah, you have intellectual humility without open-mindedness. Now, an important objection to our argument here that needs to be stated and dealt with is what we call the propositional consistency objection, right? So someone at this point might hear those two cases that I just laid out, the Daryl Davis case, the Allison Gornick case, and they might say, hold on, you're not actually demonstrating that intellectual humility and open-mindedness are conceptually distinct in those cases, right? Because to do that, you would need to show that one can be intellectually humble but not open-minded with respect to the same proposition. Now, the Daryl Davis case, right? Think about that. Daryl Davis, he's open-minded with respect to the extremists themselves, but not with respect to their extremist views, right? In other words, not only is Daryl Davis humble with respect to the extremists themselves and whether they're irredeemable moral monsters, but one could say he's also open-minded with respect to that, right? He was willing to revise his belief with respect to that proposition, the proposition about whether extremists are moral monsters. Similarly, in the Allison Gornick case, not only was she intellectually humble, the proponent of this objection might say, with respect to her abilities to persuade extremists, she was also open-minded with respect to those abilities, right? So in both of these cases, one might say, you haven't actually shown that these two character traits can come apart. Because in both of those cases, Daryl Davis and Allison Gornick are simultaneously intellectually humble and open-minded with respect to the relevant propositions. The proposition about extremists themselves in the Daryl Davis case, and the proposition about one's ability to persuade extremists in the Allison Gornick case. So the idea is that the proponent of this objection might say, in order to really kind of argue what you're trying to argue in this first part of the paper, you need to narrow your cases to a case where the extremist views themselves, right? One can be intellectually humble, but not open-minded with respect to the extremist views themselves. Not the extremists as people, not our abilities to persuade the extremists, but the views themselves, right? We need a case where we can humbly own the limitations in our beliefs about extremist views themselves, while simultaneously being unwilling to revise those beliefs, right? Without being open-minded. And we believe that we can respond effectively to this objection by considering three other cases. Excuse me. So number one, we can own the limitations in our evidence against extremist views, right? We can recognize that some of our arguments against white supremacy are stronger than others. We can also own the limitations in our belief-forming processes, right? Our beliefs about the falsity of extremist views are accumulated through various forms of induction, deduction, perception, testimony. All of these processes are, while reliable generally, they can be fallible, right? So we should be intellectually humble with respect to that fact, acknowledge that these processes are not infallible, and then own this limitation. And then thirdly, we can own the limitations in our degree of confidence and against extremist views, right? So we can admit that our confidence in our beliefs against extremist views, in some cases, it's not 100%, right? So take like election denial, for example. Are you 100% confident, 100, that the election denial claims that people make are false. You could say, no, maybe not 100%, maybe 98.5%, maybe 99.5%, right? But just having the humility to recognize it's not 100, you can own that limitation too, right? So all these three examples here, these are examples of being humble, owning your limitations regarding different aspects of your beliefs against extremist views themselves. And the point is that you can do this, you can own those limitations in these ways without being open-minded, right? Because the basic idea is that owning these limitations, it doesn't entail success in lowering your confidence in these beliefs. And even if it did, our reliability, evidence for, and confidence in these beliefs is so strong, even a slight reduction in our epistemic confidence wouldn't trigger a willingness to revise these beliefs. So let me break that down a little bit, because this is kind of the most technical part of the paper. The idea is to be willing to revise one's beliefs, right? To be open-minded. One needs to reduce their confidence in those beliefs, right? So if I have a deeply held belief and now I say to myself, okay, Cody, you're going to be open-minded with respect to this belief, right? In order to be open-minded to this deeply held belief, I need to reduce my epistemic confidence in the idea that that belief is true. So there seems to be, right, this connection between willingness to revise belief, reduce one's epistemic confidence. Now, the objector might say, like, well, hold on a second. By owning the limitations in all of these, and our beliefs about the falsity of extremist views, that triggers a lowering of your epistemic confidence in those beliefs, and therefore a willingness to revise those beliefs. So the objector might say, you can't have, you can't be intellectually humble with respect to extremist views themselves while simultaneously being closed-minded, right? That's the idea. Owning your limitations in these beliefs requires a reduction of epistemic confidence in those beliefs, which thereby triggers a willingness to revise those beliefs. That's the objector's claim. And our response is, no. You can intellectually own and be humble with respect to extremist views themselves without being willingness to revise. Because again, one, limitations owning doesn't necessarily entail a reduction in one's epistemic confidence, right? So like I can own my limitation with respect to, I can be intellectually humble with respect to these extremist views themselves. But owning my limitations in that way doesn't necessarily trigger a reduction in epistemic confidence. And even if it did, the reduction in epistemic confidence that follows from that limitations owning wouldn't be enough to trigger a wholesale willingness to revise your beliefs about, say, white supremacy. In other words, our arguments against white supremacy are so robust that, yeah, we can be intellectually humble about different minor elements of these arguments and these beliefs, right? Again, the fact that our degree of confidence isn't 100%, or some arguments are stronger than others. Our arguments are so strong that, yeah, even a minor reduction of epistemic confidence wouldn't trigger a willingness to revise. So I probably could have explained that more clearly, but hopefully it's clear enough. This is kind of the most technical in the weeds part of the paper, I think. And I do think it's the most important objection that we need to respond to, right? And I think that we do so effectively. Okay, so now moving on to the second part of the paper, right? So again, just zooming out, first part of the paper, arguing that we can be intellectually humble but not open-minded in response to extremist views. It's possible to distinguish these in conceptual space. And now the second part of the paper, arguing that not only can we, but we should be intellectually humble but not open-minded in response to extremist views that we know to be false. So a few words just about intellectual virtues. In addition to subscribing to normative contextualism and the idea that character traits are not always virtues, but they may be depending on the context, we also acknowledge that there's more than one way for a trait to be an intellectual virtue. In the virtue epistemology literature, a distinction is often made between reliabilist effects virtues and responsibilist character virtues. Roughly, a trait will be a reliabilist effects virtue insofar as it tends to produce a preponderance of good epistemic effects, right? True beliefs. Whereas for a trait to be a responsibilist character virtue, it must be partly constituted by good epistemic motives, like a motive for truth, good judgment in epistemic contexts, and things like that. So again, our argument is focusing more on reliabilist effects virtues, right, as opposed to responsibilist character virtues. And again, we think that the effects, from an effects standpoint, it's virtuous to be intellectually humble but not open-minded in response to extremist views that we know to be false because of the two main differences between the character traits that I highlighted near the beginning of the talk. Namely, again, open-mindedness entails engagement with others and a willingness to revise one's beliefs in a way that intellectual humility doesn't. And then, yeah, one qualification is we don't intend this argument to be wholesale, right? We don't pretend to be completely exhaustive and to canvass all the epistemic effects of being intellectually humble but not open-minded. We're not drawing definitive conclusions, right? We're really just kind of making a start at this argument that future scholars can build upon. The main goal being, again, to provide initial reasons for taking this view seriously, since it's so often overlooked in the literature, and since these two character traits, open-mindedness and intellectual humility, are so often conflated in the literature. Okay. Okay, so first we start with the epistemic effects of responding open-mindedly to extremist views on an individual level, right? So first that's the kind of way that we proceed. We think about the epistemic effects of open-minded responses to extremist views, and then we juxtapose those epistemic effects with intellectually humble but not open-minded responses to extremist views, to show that it's better to be humble. So starting with open-minded responses to extremist views, we consider the epistemic effects of responding open-mindedly for the knowledge-possessing agent, for the extremist, and for the broader epistemic environment, right? So first, let's just consider the epistemic effects of responding open-mindedly for the knowledge-possessing agent, right? So for someone like you, who might be watching this, who knows that white supremacy and election denials are false, and now let's say you're in a context online when you're encountering an extremist view of this source, and you're going to be open-minded in response to it, right? What effect could that have on you as the knowledge-possessing agent? And we argue that it could have negative epistemic effects on you, right? I mean, in the worst case scenario, it could actually radicalize you, right? By being open-minded to these extremist views, by actually putting your beliefs into play, a willingness to revise your beliefs, you might begin to doubt your own beliefs or even potentially be radicalized yourself in the worst case scenario. But even short of that, right? Even if you don't actually become radicalized yourself, you can still lose epistemic confidence in your true beliefs by being open-minded in response to extremists. And this can be caused by your willingness to revise your beliefs, or it could also be caused by the engagement requirement of open-mindedness, right? Again, the fact that open-mindedness requires you to engage with others who have opposing views. Because empirical research suggests that frequent exposure to a claim can increase both the fluency in processing it and the confidence in the truth of the claim, right? While decreasing confidence in claims that conflict with it, right? So there's tons of empirical research that attests to this. The idea being that, yeah, if you hear something enough times from enough people on, say, social media, even if you know it's false, the repeated exposure of just encountering it can kind of epistemically derange you over time and cause you to lose confidence in your beliefs, right? So the mere fact that you're in open-mindedness requires engaging with these extremist views could make you vulnerable to these priming effects that come from frequent exposure. And then thirdly, it could also just, by engaging with extremists, it could just be an epistemic opportunity cost for you as the knowledge possessing agent, right? You could otherwise spend your time pursuing more valuable intellectual endeavors than engaging with, say, crackpot conspiracy theorists online. So there's the first point, right? responding open-mindedly to extremists can have negative epistemic effects for you, the knowledge-possessing agent. What about the effects that it could have on the extremists themselves? Well, we think that it could endow a credibility excess on the extremists, right? By responding open-mindedly, you can signal to the extremists that um, they're credible enough for you to actually put your beliefs back into play and reopen your inquiry on a particular topic, right? And that kind of credibility excess can facilitate different intellectual vices like intellectual arrogance, right? So that's a negative epistemic effect for the extremists themselves, where you wrongly signal to them that they're credible enough to be, and serious, intellectually serious enough that um, you're willing to really open up your beliefs, willing to revise your beliefs on a particular topic. And now, what about the epistemic effects for the broader epistemic environment, right? Again, in this paper, our argument pertains to both online and offline environments. But in writing it, we mostly have in mind online environments just because that's where so much discourse takes place nowadays in our society. And particularly when you're considering the effects for the broader epistemic environment, they can be magnified online because there can be such a big audience to different interactions, right? So in terms of the epistemic effect for the broader environment of responding open-mindedly to extremist views, we also think it's going to be negative, right? Let's say you're a social media influencer and you're going to be a open-minded one, right? So you encounter an extremist white supremacist online and you say to yourself, okay, as a good open-minded person, I'm going to engage with them and, willing to revise my beliefs, hear them out. But by doing so, you're platforming them and you're disseminating misinformation to all your third-party viewers, right? So that's going to be negative epistemic effects. And then also you could signal a credibility excess not only to the extremist by open-mindedly engaging with them, but to the viewers of the interaction, right? You can signal to your audience that, oh, this social media influencer is talking to this person. This extremist must have some kind of epistemic authority, right? So you wrongly signal and platform and give credibility from the perspective of the audience to the extremist. And then also the priming and repetition effects that I just talked about can also be incurred by the audience as well, right? Insofar as the audience is frequently exposed to extremist views like white supremacy or election denial, they can start to become epistemically deranged over time through this frequent exposure, even if they know these views to be false, right? So that's our basic argument there with respect to the negative epistemic effects that can result for you, for the extremists, for the broader environment by responding open-mindedly to the extremists. And now let's juxtapose that with the epistemic effects that might follow by responding with intellectual humility, but not open-mindedness to the extremist. So one, again, just considering the epistemic effects for the knowledge-possessing agent, right? Here we think we can, by responding intellectually humbly, you can avoid a lot of the bad epistemic effects of open-minded responses for the knowledge-possessing agent, right? Again, for the intellectually humble agent, there's no requirement for engagement, which means reducing the epistemic opportunity costs and the priming effects that I just talked about, right? If you're a social media, go back to the social media influencer example. If you're a social media influencer, and again, you have the situation where there's some prominent white supremacists and they ask to be on your stream. Now, as a intellectually humble but not open-minded person, you say to yourself, actually, I don't think engaging is the right thing to do here, so I'm not going to engage. And by not engaging, I'm going to reduce the epistemic opportunity costs, negative effect, and also minimize the priming effects, right? So there you can see how that main difference between the two traits can lead to different epistemic effects in the environment. And then also, again, intellectual humility doesn't entail a willingness to revise one's beliefs, which means that there won't be that threat of reducing one's epistemic confidence in their beliefs insofar as one's intellectually humble. And of course, just being intellectually humble can facilitate good effects for the knowledge possessing agent in other ways, in addition to just avoiding the bad negative effects of open-minded engagement with the extremist, right? So just by being intellectually humble, by owning your intellectual limitations, that can facilitate self-knowledge, which is itself a good epistemic effect, right? So they're responding intellectually humbly to the extremists avoids the bad epistemic effects for the knowledge-possessing agent. Now, what about the extremists themselves? Again, we think it can avoid a lot of the negative epistemic effects, right? So let's say that, again, social media influencer example, now you figure you're in a context where you might engage with the extremists, but you're going to do so in a way that's intellectually humble, but not open-minded. You can avoid that threat of credibility excess that I talked about, right? So here, a real life case here that I have in mind is the case of Megan Phelps Roper, who left the Westboro Baptist Church through interactions with people on Twitter, I believe. And these people on Twitter that de-radicalized her, in my interpretation, were essentially engaging with her in an intellectually humble but not open-minded manner, right? They were very clear that they were not willing to revise their beliefs. They were confident that the views Megan Phelps Roper was espousing were false, but they still respected her as an epistemic agent, right? They didn't just write her off. They were humble and with respect to their weaknesses when it came to their arguments. And that approach of intellectual humility without open-mindedness was effective in de-radicalizing Megan Phelps Roper, right? And they were able to do that while avoiding the credibility excess thing again, right? They were able to engage with her, signaling that they clearly think she's false and they're not willing to revise their beliefs, while nevertheless respecting her as an epistemic agent. So in that way, intellectually humble but not open-minded responses can avoid the negative epistemic effects for the extremists themselves. And now finally, what about the broader epistemic environment? Again, since intellectual humility doesn't entail engagement, you can avoid the platforming, right? You're just not going to decide not to platform the extremists, so therefore my audience will avoid the priming effects, avoid the dissemination of misinformation. And, you can imagine cases where even though intellectual humility doesn't entail engagement, there might be cases where it warrants engagement. So the social media influencer example, you have the intellectually humble social media influencer. And let's say now they're in a case where they think, actually, I'm going to engage with this white supremacist because I think I can do so in a responsible manner, right? Whereas open-mindedness entails kind of platforming across the board, intellectual humility can accommodate more responsible platforming, right? Where in a case where you don't think you can responsibly platform someone, you just choose not to engage. But then in a case where you can responsibly platform someone, the intellectually humble agent might choose to engage. And what would that responsible platforming look like? Well, it would be, it consists of things like the social media influencer. They have the white supremacist on their stream. They clearly state from the get-go that they're not willing to revise their beliefs about white supremacy. And the social media influencer might have the rhetorical skills to effectively undermine the arguments from the white supremacist, right? So it kind of harkens back to that Alison Gornick example where she originally realized she didn't have the rhetorical skills to refute the arguments that Derek Black was giving her, but then she did her research, and then she was in a position where she had the rhetorical skills. So if the social media influencer has done their homework and they have the rhetorical skills to kind of effectively demonstrate to their audience the falsity of the white supremacist views, then that's a case where responsible platforming could avoid the negative epistemic effects that I was talking about associated with open-minded responses. So yeah, the basic summary there, again, intellectually humble agent need not engage. And when they do engage, they can kind of choose instances where the engagement would be responsible. So that's the basic idea, right? The basic idea, and again, it's not intended to be comprehensive, but you can see how these two character traits, they can come apart. And from an effects virtue standpoint, they should come apart when individually responding to extremist views. So I now want to wrap up the talk by considering some questions, objections, and our responses to them. Okay, so circling back to that relevancy restriction point that I made at the beginning of the talk, right? Again, the idea being open-mindedness is a tendency to engage seriously with relevant intellectual options and a willingness to revise one's beliefs. The relevancy restriction uh, addendum to open-mindedness is just to say that, yeah, there are some intellectual options which might not even be relevant, right? So someone might say, by failing to engage with the flat earther, you're not being open minded because that intellectual option, the intellectual option concerning whether flat earthism is true, it's just an irrelevant intellectual option. Similarly, one might say, in response to our argument, you don't fail to be open minded by not being willing to revise your beliefs that white supremacy is false, because those extremist views are irrelevant to begin with, right? They don't even fall within the scope of open mindedness. And our response there is that, yeah, while these extremist views are neither true nor epistemically justified, they are nevertheless relevant given how pervasive they are in our contemporary epistemic landscape, right? Since these extremist views, the particular ones that we're focused on, again, white supremacy and election denial, um, since they're so widespread in the digital age, they are unfortunately relevant. A second question someone might ask in response to this, our paper and our argument, are we suggesting that we should be closed rather than open-minded and responding to extremist views? Does that suggest that we should stop being open-minded altogether? And our response to that is no, it does not, right? So um, here are two distinctions you can make is first, one, you can distinguish between one-off displays of open-mindedness and intellectual humility and the actual disposition character trait of open-mindedness and intellectual humility, right? The character trait of open-mindedness and intellectual humility um, can only be developed over time through skillful habituation. Um, so yeah, just because one initiates open-minded or intellectually humble actions doesn't mean they have the character trait. So that's the first point. Second point is both of these traits can be domain specific, right? One can be open-minded with respect to certain truths, like the reality of climate change, but they can be closed-minded with respect to other truths, like systematic racism or something like that, right? So the point is, while intellectual humility and open-mindedness, they can be universal dispositions where someone is just, across the board closed-minded with respect to any stereotypically liberal belief. These traits also can be domain specific, right? One can be open-minded with respect to certain things and closed-minded with respect to others. So in terms of the scope of our paper and what we're arguing, we're just arguing that you should initiate closed-minded action in a particular context, right? In response to extremist views that we know to be false, right? So we have a very kind of narrow scope in terms of our normative argument here. Yeah, it's just concerning actions in this particular context. Third question / objection someone might ask. They might say, okay, hold on. You've argued that responding open-mindedly to extremist views can produce bad epistemic effects. But wouldn't a virtuously open-minded person ignore extremist views? In other words, wouldn't engaging with extremist views be excessively open-minded? This goes back to the structure of virtues on the Aristotelian view that I was talking about, right? How each virtue occupies a mean between a vice of excess and a vice of deficiency. And the idea here is someone might say engaging with extremist views would be manifesting the vice of excess of open-mindedness, right? Our response to this is that's just not how we're construing open-mindedness, right? Again, on our view, open-mindedness entails engagement. So ignoring extremist views would manifest the trait of closed-mindedness, right? If someone were to say that engaging with extremist views is excessively open-minded, that would imply that the mean of open-mindedness would be not engaging with extremist views. But on our view of open-mindedness, not engaging with extremist views would just be closed-mindedness because open-mindedness entails engagement. So there, yeah, I mean, people can have different definitions of open-mindedness, but that's just not how we're understanding the concept. A fourth question / objection someone might make is they might say, hold, isn't your argument dangerous? Won't extremists think that that we're the radical, that we're the extremists, right? A white supremacist might view, someone who's liberal-minded like me as the extremists. So they might agree with our argument, but just think that it applies to us and not to them. And relatedly, someone might ask, how do you know that we're in a situation um, that calls for intellectual humility and not open-mindedness? How do we know that the extremist views in question are false to begin with? I think this is a very important question slash objection. And I mean, first, yeah, extremists might think that they know that white supremacy is true, but they're wrong about it. The second part of that question, though, how do we know that the extremist views in question are false? This is a really important question, and it allows for a clarification about the scope of our argument, right? Again, our argument only applies to extremist views that we already know to be false. So if you're encountering an extremist view that you don't know to be false, there it might be appropriate to be open-minded, right? The virtue epistemologist says that we get knowledge through the exercise of intellectual virtues, right? So how do we know that an extremist view is false? In order to get that knowledge to begin with, the knowledge that a particular extremist view is false, we have to exercise intellectual virtues, one of which might be open-minded, right? So our argument, again, only pertains to views that we already know to be false. But to know that those views are false to begin with, we might have to initially be open-minded, right? But once that knowledge is acquired, then our argument can be applied moving forward in future encounters with an extremist, right? So just to make it tangible, let's say you're a young kid growing up and, it's not clear to you that a particular extremist view is false. Since you don't yet have that knowledge, you might be open-minded with respect to that view at that point. But then once you exercise the requisite intellectual virtues and come to the conclusion that, oh yeah, this extremist view is definitely false, that's where our argument kicks in, right? Then moving forward with further encounters of those extremist views, you can kind of operationalize our argument and be intellectually humble, but not open-minded from there, right? So hopefully that's clear, because I do think that's a very important point. Someone as a fifth point slash question, they might say, yeah, so you've acknowledged that intellectual humility and open-mindedness often travel together in practice, but won't it be difficult, if not impossible, to actually exercise one of these traits without the other in practice? Can we give anyone practical advice on how to do so? Our perspective here is, yes, it could certainly be difficult to practically separate these two traits, but our paper does offer some conceptual resources for how to do so, right? Again, one might just be focusing on the two main differences between the traits that we emphasize throughout the paper, right? So if you're in a situation where you want to manifest intellectual humility, but not open-mindedness, you might say to yourself, okay, well, I need to make sure that I'm not willing to revise my beliefs on the matter at hand, because that would be open-minded. And I need to be privy to the fact that engaging with an extremist in this circumstance might not be the best thing to do, right? So, but by focusing on those two main differences, that can help someone practically exercise one without the other. Of course, it's easier said than done, but. And then a last question slash objection that someone might make is they might say, aren't we kind of being irresponsible in focusing on the role of individuals in responding to extremism, right? Isn't the solution to the proliferation of extremist views in our society going to involve a structural change, right? Not individual responses. It's kind of analogous to arguments that people make about climate change, right? The solution to climate change is a system level structural solution, right? It's not going to be solved individually by everyone at an individual level, stopping to litter and reducing their carbon footprint. Similarly, someone could say here, like, yeah, that's great. These individual kind of normative prescriptions you're giving to extremist views, all well and good, but it's not really going to make a huge dent in the problem, right? The problem is only going to be solved at a system level by changing the algorithms, by different kinds of regulation, etc. And here we completely acknowledge and agree with that, right? We're not suggesting that this is going to be a wholesale solution to the problem of extremism. We completely concede that, yeah, the problem is really only going to be solved via kind of system structural level. But it's still true that extremist views are all around us, particularly online, and that as individuals, we will and do encounter them, and that we should have some normative prescription for how to respond when we do encounter them. And it's that's what we're offering in this paper, right? We think that's still valuable, even though it's not going to um, get anywhere close to solving the overall problem of the proliferation of false, harmful extremist views in our society. And with that, I believe I've reached the end of my presentation. Thank you so much for listening. Um, for anyone who is listening to this, who has any follow-up questions, feel free to email me, codyturner2222 at gmail.com, and have a great day.